Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today for our first collaborative telework webinar. We greatly appreciate you joining us. My name is Audrey DeBarros. I'm the Executive Director of a transportation management organization serving the Northwest Metro region of Denver. And we just wanted to provide a brief overview of our transportation management organizations. Again, I work for Commuting Solutions. We have with us here Stuart Anderson, who is the president of Transportation Solutions, and Michael Hughes, serving the newly formed West Corridor TMA. You see a map here that shows the TMAs that are in the Denver metro area, and together we are part of a regional program orchestrated by Dr. Cog called Way to Go, and we are working together to address our transportation and air quality issues.
Good. So next slide is mine. Morning, everyone. This is Mike. As you heard Audrey say, there are 3 organizations that are standing behind today's webinar and presentation. The West Corridor, which you see our logo there at the bottom, is the newest. And the 3 of us are doing this in concert. I think we have certainly been, I've certainly discovered since starting the West Corridor TMA that when all of the TMAs work together, we can be a pretty powerful force to get some things done. And Commuting Solutions and Transportation Solutions are 2 of the most successful. So I am admittedly riding their coattails today. And it's great to be here with Audrey and Stuart. And we want to get you into the content and talk about teleworking.
Thank you, Mike and Audrey. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about teleworking. Just in brief, to give you a little bit of my background, I was thrown into the deep end of teleworking after the Northridge earthquake. I was working in Los Angeles at the time, and much like the COVID crisis, we had people who had to go into teleworking without notice, and some employers were prepared and didn't lose a single day of work, and others lost their buildings. And I remember a few companies that were out of business for 6 weeks, 7 weeks, before they could get back up and running. So we received a grant from the federal government, the Department of Commerce, to reach out to 500 employers in Southern California to help them develop telework programs, largely for emergency preparedness, which is a big issue in Southern California with their earthquakes, but also to be able to get employers to do this more permanently. And our intent back then was to get employers who were doing it informally as a result of the emergency and to make that formal. More recently, I developed the telework materials and outreach effort for the Toronto region, which is my most current work in teleworking. But together, I've worked with about 700 employers on telework programs over the years, and hopefully through this I've been able to come up with some lessons learned and some advice that I can share with you today. I believe that we're in the webinar mode, and that means that questions are best through the chat. Is that correct, Robbie?
They will be sent through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen.
Okay, great. So I'll watch out for that, and if I don't, Audrey, Mike, Robbie, let me know, and I'll make sure I answer those questions.
Good.
Excellent. Well, let me dive into this. First off, what is teleworking? It allows employees to work from home or another designated location. It's usually on a voluntary basis, and we select the employees who get to do this. Teleworking was never really set up to have everybody do it. Some are more successful with teleworking than others, but obviously in an emergency, it means everyone. And so in many respects, I'm going to talk a little bit about a formalized program, not an emergency program, but I'll point out those aspects that relate to our current situation with COVID. It replaces the trip to work typically, and for the average worker, that can mean an hour a day. If you have a half-hour commute, it reduces costs for the employees. That's of great value for employees. And then most importantly at the bottom, the flexible workplace has become a trend within businesses. I'm probably preaching to the choir on that. We have a new generation of workers. I know My son's a millennial, and he grew up with computers and phones and the whole bit, and that's how he works. And so he's very effective at doing that. I'm a boomer, and so I had to learn the hard way about technologies and get up to speed with this. But right now, if you want to recruit and retain talent within your organization, that teleworking is increasingly becoming an expectation. And in a survey that was done across Canada, they asked employees whether or not they would be willing to accept a 10% decrease in their salary to be able to work from home, and the majority said yes. That's an important thing to remember. Teleworking can be important as 10% of your salary, and so employees really enjoy that. Moving along, it isn't always a full-time arrangement. That's an error that many of us make. In fact, it's not a good idea to go full-time unless perhaps you're a telecenter or something of a similar nature. It has impacts on your productivity. It creates isolation. There's other factors that need to be considered, and I'll talk about those today. It is not a replacement for childcare or dependent care unless with dependent care, it's simply making meals. But any distractions will make it difficult to first be professional in how you do work, and it can be a distraction. I've had 3 kids, and I know exactly how hard it is to work when they have needs. And it is not a substitute for managing a person's life, although there are exceptions to it. I know that many parents gradually come back into work, and teleworking is a great way to bring them back in. And usually that's done for a 6-month period, but not longer. And it's not always expensive. Teleworking can be done from people's home. That's by far the most common. 90% of our teleworkers are working from home. The second option is satellite work centers. This is a situation where employers will use other facilities to house their employees. Banks are the best example of this. I worked with Bank of America, and what they did when they mapped out all their employees, they realized that they had many, many, many branch offices that were closer to their employees' homes, and that because of the changing dynamic of banking, they had empty desks. And so we worked literally to create these workstations closer to people's home that they could go to and work from instead of driving all the way into the main office. And it was very successful for Bank of America and became a regular routine for them to do that. It's rare, but we do have telework centers that have been created. I often refer to the one in Grass Valley, which is near Sacramento. A developer built a community that was quite a distance from Sacramento, and in order to attract residents who would be faced with a long commute, they created a telework center for residents where they could go and work at a desk and not have to make the trip in. The other aspect of teleworking is also virtually or through hoteling. Hoteling can occur. Let me give you an example. Intuit is a company that I had worked with. And what we did is that we eliminated some of the regular offices for folks, and we created offices that you can reserve on a daily basis. So if you're working from home 3 days a week and you need to go in on Thursday, you can log in, find that office, reserve that office for you for that day. And in some cases, one firm that I worked with, they had little carts that employees could get. It had all the belongings, and they would take that cart to their designated office, like a hotel room, and work from there for that particular day. And I'll give you further examples about these various options that are out there. One thing I'd like to do before I dive into teleworking is just briefly touch on flex time, compressed work weeks, and staggered hours, because almost every telework arrangement comes with one of these arrangements on top of it, and they all have different impacts. So let me quickly define those and move on to the teleworking. Flex time is very common. 70% of employees who work in offices have some form of flex time. Flex time is highly recommended as a complement to teleworking, largely because when people work from home, they have the ability to start early or to work late. And 2/3 of the employees will opt for the earliest start that they can get. 1/3, like me, want to do it later in the day. And what we found through research is that when employees are allowed to choose those times where they're most productive, that they can actually be more efficient and effective with what they do. I have a habit of going to the gym early afternoon because that's my sleepy time. And I arrange it with my telework schedule to make sure I get in 4 hours before I head to the gym and 4 hours after I go to the gym. And so that works for me, and it accommodates my personal schedule. So it is a common element that comes with teleworking. One of the core aspects that relate to flex time is core time, and that also applies to telework. Oftentimes, it's best just to define a time within the day. So for example, 10 a.m. to noon, you have to be at your desk. If there are going to be online meetings, it's going to be during that core time. In teleworking, sometimes they do core days. I have seen employers who take Tuesday, for whatever reason, Tuesday is a popular day, where all employees are expected to be in the office, and that's when they schedule their staff meetings, face-to-face meetings. And one of the interesting aspects about this that I find interesting is that by using core days, employers are more effective and efficient. Instead of having random meetings throughout the week, it's done on one day. You come in with an expectation that you're going to be doing meetings. You come prepared, and then you work from home. And so there are added benefits to look at doing this together. And I'll reference the core days again a little bit further. Compressed work week schedules don't have necessarily a positive effect on teleworking. It really depends on how you set this up. Most employees tend to work around getting something done when they're at home. They don't tend to watch the time clock. This would certainly be an issue for your non-exempt employees where you do have to track hours. I know of an employer here in Denver, 20th Century, well, they changed their name, a mutual fund company, that you had to log into your computer like a timesheet. And when you left, you had to log out of your computer. And so that was their way to track their non-exempt employees. With exempt employees, it's less of a factor. But employees tend to work more hours. And so oftentimes, if you do a 980 type program, you'll have one extra day off and people can work 9-hour days. Most people are effective up to 9 hours. We find that the 10th hour with a 440 program, that there can be a loss in productivity, and it merely relates to what type of work people are doing. If you have a routine, regular task throughout the whole day, what we found is that in that 9th to 10th hour, that the error rate tends to be high enough to create a need to correct things such that that last hour isn't worth it. And so, but if you have somebody who can organize their day, so for example, if you're productive in the morning, that you do those items that require the greatest degree of concentration earlier in the day and leave those things to the end of the day that require less concentration, that you can maintain and grow your productivity when working from home. The 312 schedules are pretty much reserved for hospitals. For some reason, nurses and doctors can work 12-hour days and still remain productive, but it really is limited to certain groups. You'll see that also with manufacturing. I worked with a chicken processing plant, and they worked around a 12-hour schedule. And so we put a lot of their financial staff on teleworking arrangements, and they worked the same schedules that the employees were as well. So they worked 12-hour days. But this is really an exception. Staggered work hours can be of value if you want to be able to address traffic congestion in a particular item. This can be very effective. Some employers will stagger their telework employees so they have coverage throughout the day. I worked with a public agency in Ventura County in California, and what they found through their telework program was that they could offer the public a 12-hour customer coverage when their employees were teleworking, and they staggered their employees throughout the day to turn an 8-hour workday and interaction with the customer into a 12-hour. And so it turned out to be quite successful. For this particular public agency, that was of value, because the first thing that came to mind with many of the public was they're doing this telework program so they can go home and play. And I think that when they turned this around and offered greater services, it was seen as great value. I'll refer back to these on occasion, but I wanted to define those before we got into teleworking itself. Teleworking has changed, and I want to talk a little bit about how that has changed, because this is what's critical and how we make this successful. I mentioned that we have a new generation of workers. We have more technologies to support teleworking. Most employers have firewalls now and are set up to work remotely. We also have an array of different technologies, and I can provide you with a list of these that can, if you don't have a firewall, can work for you. And sometimes they're as simple as getting a Dropbox account where you can pull up your files at home and you can pull them up in the office. So this is something that you can do and will be of value for those smaller employers who are trying to do this. Also, kind of the third element is back in the old days, the Northridge earthquake happened, we found that many HR professionals didn't know the details of teleworking. Now, many of our HR professionals are experts. And so our job hasn't been as much providing the expertise, but rather providing the tools that help these experts implement programs. So after today, if there are any items where you need further assistance or further resources, you are welcome to contact Audrey, Michael, or myself, and we'll see if we can find a resource for you, because we know that in many cases you are the expert. The rate of the adoption of these strategies in the United States is about the slowest internationally in the developed world. In Germany, they have almost a rate of 35% teleworking. We also found South American countries have almost 30 to 35%. In South America, the reason is because they have the worst congestion you've ever seen. If you don't know bad congestion, go to Sao Paulo and you'll see it. You can see why they're motivated to get teleworking done. We tend to be in the range of 12 to 14%. Canada's at 11%. They're below us in their adoption. I see this as an opportunity. If German firms can work with 35% teleworking, why can't we? So the potential to grow from a 14% usage rate to 35% is there. There's definitely that capacity. And hopefully through this COVID experience for many of the employers, that they'll increase the number of people who work in a telework arrangement. Many employers do not recognize the benefit of these programs in reducing commute trips or their carbon footprint. I had worked with an employer in Milpitas in California, and when I sat down with them to talk about teleworking, the firm is called LifeScan. They said to me, we're a very conservative company. We wouldn't do teleworking. It's not something that really is appropriate. Between our first meeting and our second meeting, I pulled up a little bit about the firm. It's a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson. I knew that Johnson & Johnson had a climate change initiative. And within that, they were asking all of their sites and subsidiaries to reduce their carbon footprint by 15%. I mentioned this on our second meeting, and they said, well, there's no way. We don't produce anything here. There's nothing we can do to reduce emissions. I said, well, what about your commute trips? And they're like, oh, yes, you're right. And actually, what happened then is LifeScan actually was able to get up to speed with the expectation of the climate change initiative from Johnson & Johnson. They far exceeded that 15% reduction in their carbon footprint. But they didn't put two and two together until we talked with them about it. In the old days, we focused a lot on productivity. Telework, because it's going to increase productivity. We don't do that anymore. It does impact productivity. But promoting teleworking around productivity is now viewed by labor unions and many HR professionals as exploitive. If you're sending people home to get them to work more hours without additional compensation, this is not a good move. We could do it 20 years ago, but today you're setting yourself up for trouble, and especially with your non-exempt employees. Job satisfaction certainly increases. That was a big aspect of it. Congestion relief was also another aspect that related to teleworking. Today, our number one selling point is the flexible workplace. And it's this new business model that many firms are working toward. In Canada, I found that was our easiest selling point, to say, all of you are somewhat adapting to a different generation and a different way of working. You know, teleworking is part of that equation. And so we were quite successful in opening the doors. We also knew, especially from high-tech companies, that in order to recruit and retain employees, telework was almost essential. I can't tell you how many employers have said to me that employees who are being recruited ask whether or not teleworking is an option. It is an expectation. Carbon footprint reduction, it kind of depends where you are. In Canada, it's a priority. In California, it's a priority with the air quality situation. And with our air quality situation getting so bad that I think that we will need to look at using teleworking to reduce our carbon footprint. It can reduce costs. I worked in Florida on a teleworking initiative in Tampa. I worked with MetLife. MetLife had maxed out the capacity at their current location. They were looking at, I think, a $15 million expansion of their facility. We talked to them about teleworking. They were reluctant to do it, but they knew that other MetLife sites were offering teleworking. We convinced them to do a pilot. And the pilot was so successful that they expanded it to the level where they didn't need to do the expansion. And they are still in the same building. And then when I came back and spoke with them later about the impact, they said the benefit that they got, above all, was that they were able to recruit employees who lived very far distances from work, people who lived 2 hours away. And they were able to find employees that could match their pay scale by reaching out further. We see that happening in Colorado. I know of a firm in Broomfield that actually recruits employees in Nebraska. That tends to be the area that they look at, and they rely on teleworking. Employees in that example had to come to the main office once a month. At MetLife, they were required to come in once a week. So if you have to make a 2-hour commute once a week, it's not as bad. But anyway, it's worked well for MetLife. Employees are more effective, and the flex time component is part of that. And employees tend to be more productive. The average gain in productivity for teleworkers, and this is based on a study of a combination of case examples, they found that the average increase in productivity is plus 12%. Rarely do we see teleworking go down in productivity. The more teleworking, the better used to be the motto. Now we know we need to select the right people for it. And often when I approach an employer, the first thing they say is we need to be equitable. Everybody needs to be eligible. My first response to that is there are people who are not ready. Some employers require employees to work with the firm for 1 year before they're eligible for teleworking. And I have found that to be a wise recommendation because employees don't capture that corporate culture, nor do they create the connections within the office to understand what resources are available for them. And so that has been a big challenge. That was a challenge for the firm in Broomfield, recruiting in Nebraska, that they found many of their new employees didn't get the mindset of what they were doing. And that was challenging. On the other side of the equation for this employer, because they had such a big customer focus, they were a travel agency for off hours, that they could have employees work split shifts. So they do 4 hours in the morning, 4 hours late afternoon. And many employees like that, having the middle of the day to do things. But it fit their business model. Teleworking is a business practice that we're seeing more and more often. Where we see failures, and we do see failures, it's when programs are not formalized. Many employers are doing teleworking right now because of COVID, but they don't have policies. And the policies are critical. And I'll explain this as I get into this a little bit further. The main obstacles with teleworking has always been the middle managers. And despite what we think with all our training about management by objective, we still find that a good portion of managers don't know how to manage by objective. That in fact, they do still rely on seeing their employee at their desk. And so much has been studied in teleworking because it does impact productivity. So we've taken the microscope to look at some of these very carefully. And what we have found is that middle managers learn how to manage by objective by having a telework program. And one employer that I had worked with, they said, irrespective of a benefit of our teleworking, we finally feel that our managers understand management by objective, even though we've trained them practically every year for the last 10 years. Isolation is a real thing. There are a lot of employees who rely on their friends in the office for their social contact. And there are many people who back out of teleworking because they feel isolated. We also have found through research that the 5-day telework arrangement is not ideal. What is ideal is a 2 to 3 day arrangement where people can work from home, and that's what's recommended. If you have labor unions, we don't have many here in Colorado, but where you do have that involvement, they are watching for any aspect that might be exploitive. But if you're doing it for the sake of the employees, to provide them with a better ability to manage their personal work life, they're usually on board. I've rarely seen a union who has opposed this after we got past that issue of whether we're exploiting them to get more productivity. Here and there just because of our schedule, but feel free if you need to ask a question or come back to this, let me know. When telework is correctly implemented and formalized, 74% see increases in productivity. 85% of the managers report better productivity. And we surveyed the teleworkers and the telemanagers that are connected together. And it was really odd to see that managers saw higher productivity than the employees actually did. Only 2% of the managers reported a decrease in productivity. Among those who reported an increase, the 12% is across the organization. This is now at the individual level, that individuals can be at 20%. And I'll explain the differences between looking at the whole program versus just the individual. The item that is tied to that is that people who are left in the office will often see a decrease in productivity. And so you need to plan ahead for that. And part of planning ahead is getting managers to understand that when you have a fire in the office, your best candidate to talk to fix that is probably a teleworker, because they'll be at their office and at their desk. The sense that you have access to your employee all the time just because they're at their desk isn't true. There was a study that actually looked at that, and I don't remember the stats for it, but it certainly was a factor that came with this. I'm going to skip this, but if you'd like a copy of the slides, you can read it. It says essentially the types of things that I've just explained, and it came out in Forbes, very credible, and certainly something that is important. It really is about the workplace of the future. I really like this output that came from one of the Canadian companies. This is actually Microsoft Canada in Mississauga. And they actually produced this fact sheet about their experience. And if you request the slides, you can look at this more carefully. But I really enjoyed sharing this with other employers to kind of show how their experience was and how successful it was. We use this all the time in promoting it to other employers. And Microsoft US does the same thing as well. I just haven't seen an infographic like this being produced. So this is the one I'm sharing with you, but it's an overall positive experience. Getting to the nuts and bolts of this, and let me check our time. There are 10 typical steps. In the old days, we used to walk through them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Nowadays, we say, pick this as a menu, pick out those items that you need to do. Oftentimes, you have the support of a management, of upper management, and you have a coordinator designated. Larger organizations may need steering committees. An example, we worked with Jefferson County on their telework program, and being a government agency, they had the full array. They had people who worked in the jail. They had people who worked in finance. They had people who worked on roads, and so we had to look carefully at how this was done, and we formed a steering committee with representatives from each of their various business units so that we could see how it could work together and be successful. I'm going to quickly go through these 10 steps. Usually, selling to upper management is not hard on teleworking. They can see from the bigger picture perspective the value that's tied with it. Convincing middle managers is the challenge. Employers feel like they need to convince employees. We don't need to convince employees. And actually pressuring employees to want to do teleworking puts them in a situation that might make them feel isolated. So I always tell employers, you know, pitch this to middle managers, but leave the employees alone to figure this out on their own. They're automatically motivated to do this. Upper management, of course, these are the questions you'd have: productivity, cost coverage, bottom line impact, recruitment and retention. Those are things that telework can satisfy. Middle managers, how do I manage when I can't see them? How do I communicate with them? I actually had a middle manager, and this is no joke, at a company who was so resistant to the telework program and so convinced his employees would cheat that on the first week of implementing teleworking, no joke, he called every one of his employees every hour. And as soon as he found somebody not at his desk, he reached out to the telework coordinator who I was working with and said, "This is a failure. Jane was not at her desk. I called a minute later and she wasn't there." And it was like, but she might have to go to the restroom, or she might be taking a break. So it was really a challenge. We won him over eventually, but he genuinely called them. It was really quite funny. Cost issues. Most employers do not invest in equipment for their employees. We worked with Health One on Colorado Boulevard in Denver to help set up a telework program for them. And they had kind of a crunch for space. And one of the things that they looked at doing was sharing desks. So they had one employee off half the week of teleworking and the other coming into the office, and they switched. So two people shared the desk. The problem they encountered was that they essentially were processing letters, the folks that were teleworking. And when they came back into the office, they had all their letters on their zip drive, and they plugged it into the printer, and they cranked out all these letters. It created a log jam. It was really problematic. They finally decided to buy printers for people who work from home. They weren't expensive, it solved the problem, and it worked well for everyone. And at the end of the day, there was concern, well, how do we retrieve this printer? And yes, you can have the sheriff come and get that as long as it's within your policy. But for a printer that costs $160, it's probably not worth calling the sheriff. But think about who you're putting in a telework arrangement. And I have seen employers who have retrieved laptops by going to employees' home, but it's not ideal. And first thing that the law enforcement will ask is they want to see your policies to make sure that you clearly articulated to employees that these computers don't belong to them. Middle managers, I've talked a lot about this, so I'm going to kind of skip through this. And I'm going to bring up the ergonomic issue, which is at the bottom. Do we inspect the home office? That's always a question that we have, and I'll address that in just a second. Selecting the coordinator, there needs to be somebody within the organization who is willing to stand up to the middle managers and get them to accept this idea. And so that role is really critical. And it usually is an HR professional who does this. And they need to be an advocate. So that can be an important consideration. Forming the steering committee that I had talked about, like with Jefferson County, usually it takes about 4 months to design a telework program. Now, if you're in a COVID situation, you'll have no time, but you're probably like, we implemented it informally, now we want to formalize it. Usually it takes employers about 4 months to work through this process, and these are the typical type of meetings that you would see with a steering committee. Developing policies is absolutely critical. The employee handbook that employees receive when they start work is actually the contract that the employer makes with their employee. And if you do not have telework policies in your employee handbook, you have no contract with your employees about teleworking. So what you'll need to do is either change your policies and provide employees about that information, or you need to create a telework arrangement that articulates these policies. Some employers have employees sign on the dotted line, but it essentially goes through these various elements that are there that relate to the home office. Estimating cost, I talked about that a little bit. in almost every example, that ultimately the productivity offset the cost of buying things. I have found employers to become very, very generous. I worked with the Houston Postal Credit Union many years ago. The pay scale for their employees that they wanted to put into teleworking was such that they didn't have big houses with extra rooms they can create into offices. What they decided to do is they bought their employees what's called an office in a box. And it was literally a cabinet that you could put in your living room that had doors you could close, but behind it was a desk and shelves up above it. And they purchased that. At that time, it was $1,200, and they purchased it for every one of their employees. And it really worked well. It kept their materials safe, and it offered the employees an environment that was ergonomic and something that they could work from. And that worked for them. I think that from a perspective of fairness, if an employee doesn't have a home office space, you can't exclude them from teleworking. Ultimately, we need to accommodate them. They can't be held at fault because they have a studio apartment. Assessing technology needs, I talked about this. This used to be much bigger issue. The firm in Broomfield that I had worked with, I was talking with their IT guy about their experience with this because they had decided to go with people's own computers. And it was much more costly than purchasing computers for their employees, because they had people with Apples and they had people with old computers, new computers, and it was a complete nightmare. And one of the things he said to me, the thing that is most frustrating is that when people would call and ask for assistance, the first thing he would say, did you turn your computer off and turn it back on? And that addressed, he said, a third of the issues. So we need to teach employees, turn your computer off and turn it on. But that was a particular issue with them. They also had a problem because when they initially started, they didn't designate an IT person as their contact. So the teleworkers were less visible. They weren't standing at the desk saying, help me fix my computer. And the people at home felt that they were being left out of it. And that's why they came back and designated one IT person to be specifically responsible for those who are working from home. When we did a survey with that employer after 6 months, the number one complaint that we got, and this is true, was the fact that they didn't get their annual discount pass to, was it called Waterworld in Arvada? It was something they were used to, and they put it up on the employee board. And you could grab these savings certificates, and people were complaining, we feel like we're left out. We don't know what else you're putting up on the employee board that we're missing out on. And it truly was an issue. And so they decided anything they put up on the employee board will be available to the teleworkers. That also ties in with the lack of formal communication. Believe it or not, the majority of communication regarding corporate policy and changes is done informally. So we needed to get this company to put those things in writing instead of relying on word of mouth. I mentioned the generational differences. They do play out. I know some people are tired of hearing millennials and boomers and Generation X, but there is a big difference between them. And so it's important to understand the different things that they would be looking at and how their philosophy is about the workplace. Selecting the right candidates is a very important thing. If you're having a problem employee who's having trouble getting to work on time, don't send them home. If you're having trouble with them producing what they need to produce, don't send them home. If you have somebody who's been with your company for a while and is a great performer and wants to work from home, say yes. And you can set that up in an arrangement that will make some sense. You'll have to look at the job function. You'll need to look at what the teleworker needs to have as far as characteristics. The way I usually address this is I do a self-assessment survey with these potential telework candidates. And I ask them questions like, do you have children who will return from school at 3 o'clock? And if so, how have you created an office arrangement where you won't have distractions? And things like that. And I have seen many people bow out of it and say, gosh, I can't. I have 6 children. They all come home and they all scream. But it's something that people can assess for themselves. This is also a form that I've used to kind of go through each of these tasks. I use this really to help managers use it for a conversation with their employee about teleworking and creating that relationship. Who are teleworking? It's across the board. I worked with the city of Irvine in Orange County, California. When we first sat down with them, they said, well, I think most of our departments could be eligible for teleworking except the police. And the police said, no, we don't want to be left out. And the funny thing is, we did get the police engaged, and we placed their detectives on 1 day a week teleworking. And what the detectives did is they did all their paperwork on their telework day. And our biggest champions for the telework pilot at the end of the pilot were the detectives. And they said that they couldn't get their paperwork done during the week. There never seemed to be the time, but when they organized and worked from home one day, they could get it done. Now, this is specific to the Irvine Police Department, but it worked for them. I talked a little bit about the eligibility criteria. I just want to give you a sense of what some employers do. Some employers will do things like if you're evaluated on a this is just an example, on a 10-point scale on your annual evaluation. I saw an employer that said you have to score 7 or above to even be eligible for teleworking. I mentioned the 1 year with the company. That's a good practice. Grade level can be that as well, but I don't like to have it restricted. There's nothing worse than sending your managers get a telework, but no one else does. That's a mistake. So you really need to look at who's eligible and how that can be done. Employee characteristics I talked about. Always remember the isolation factor. It's bigger than you think. I've had quite a few employers where one of the top reasons why people stop teleworking, and this is no joke, was weight gain. I've had a lot of employees who said, I need to go back into the office because I can't stop eating when I work from home. And it happens more often than you think. This is another form that I use in evaluating characteristics that relate to teleworking. We can provide you with samples of these materials if you would like them, or again, you can request our slides. Training is probably the biggest factor between success and failure. We feel that you need to have a telework training. Half of it needs to be devoted to the policies and procedures that you have, and the other half needs to be devoted to managers working with their employee to identify measurable things that they can do from home. And sometimes I've actually had managers and employees fill out a form together at the beginning of each week with what they're supposed to accomplish from home, and then revisit that and do that for a month until you start understanding how to convey your productivity. And that is an excellent exercise for people to engage with. We can provide you with some sample slides and information that could be used in your telework training. Adjustments for managers. I talked about managing their results. Learning to trust your employees is critical. Developing good communication and setting up core times, critical. Maintaining a team environment is also critical, and that's also addressed partly through your core hours and your core days. And managers, above all, feel that they're losing control if they can't see their employees. And we need to give them the confidence that they are able to do that. I'm almost done. I know I'm out of time shortly. Adjustments for employees. Figuring out how to be a team when you're remote is very challenging. Good organization skills are critical, and removing your distractions. When I lived in Los Angeles, I had this Australian guy across the street who never seemed to need to work. And he would come over in the morning if he'd see my car, and he would bring a cup of coffee to me. And I sat down with him, but he talked on and on and on. And it got to the point where he just figured if my car is in the driveway, I'm there to chat. So I literally had to sit him down and say, please understand, I'm working. If you want to come over at between 10 and 10:15, I'm taking my break then. That's fine. But at the end of the 15 minutes, I have to get back to work. This is no joke. And we had to deal with that so that I could be effective in my teleworking. The question of whether or not you need to inspect the home office has been addressed very clearly by OSHA. There is a one-page description that will tell you what you should and should not do. And one of the should nots is inspect the home office. When you as an employer inspect the home office, you assume the legal responsibility for maintaining that office as a safe work environment. And that would mean multiple inspections. What OSHA says that you need to do is you need to educate your employees about appropriate ergonomics, how to set up their office, and how to do it correctly. And these are adults who can do this and figure it out. When this first came out by OSHA, we found employers providing technical manuals on ergonomics. And OSHA came back later and said, no, you need to provide ergonomic guidance that is easy to understand. If you give them a technical manual that they can't understand, and then they set up the wrong kind of office, and then you get sued, you might be held responsible for that. And so this was critical in how we do this correctly. These are just some tips. They're so easy to understand. And this is actually what many employers have used, and you could use this as well. These are the types of things that you really need to look at: the height of the chair, the height of the desk, whether sunlight is coming in right to their eyes and they look into the sun. These are all issues that need to be addressed, but this is critical. On the idea of taking a break, that's important too. I have found employers who actually require employees to get up, get dressed, walk around the block before they're allowed to telework. No joke, they have done that. And so they want their employees to make that separation between the bed and the desk. And any of you who've teleworked, you know that. And so that can be challenging. What we have found is that, yeah, go ahead.
We've got a question about workers' compensation and injuries in the home office. So while you've got
excellent
OSHA stuff up, let's do that.
Yeah, actually that was perfect timing, because that's what I was going to move into. That people need to understand that workers' comp is not tied to your place. It's tied to you. So where you work is your work environment, and workers' comp always applies. It applies in the home space. I always ask employers to contact their insurer to make sure whether or not they have specific requirements that relate to telework. And the most common requirement that these insurers will ask is they ask that the employees draw a map of their home and show the areas that they'll be in. So if they have an office, that's where they're to work. If they're going to eat lunch in the kitchen, that's where they're going to be and where their restroom is at. So if an employee is sitting at poolside in their apartment building and drops the laptop into the pool or gets injured, then they were violating the rules. And so that's a whole different ballgame. But that's what insurers have asked. And every insurance company is a little bit different. So please call them. Your situation may be unique, but I like the idea of drawing a map. It underscores the fact that you just can't sit anywhere. In the old days, they didn't like people going to coffee shops to work. Nowadays, it's recommended. It actually is a good idea. And if somebody is working from home and you need a little bit of social interaction, and I do this myself, I'm a block and a half from a coffee shop, and I'll take my laptop down there, and I just, even though I don't talk to anybody, I feel like I'm at least around other people. And so I try to do that periodically. I hope that addressed the question on that. If not, you can follow up with that. The other aspect that's important is to evaluate your program. I have never found a perfect telework program. I recommend that you do this after 3 months or 6 months, which is ideal. The reason why we don't do it before 3 months is because of the Hawthorne effect that most of us have learned about in school, that the reality of introducing something new, that people are going to outperform. Teleworkers always outperform because they want to keep it in a pilot. But you've got to wait for at least 3, 4, 5, 6 months to really let it level out, to see what the real reactions are. Because if you survey them in the first month, it's going to be inflated and it won't be accurate. I had mentioned earlier about providing support. We're here, we're your resource. We are all under the umbrella of Way to Go, and Telework Tomorrow is the name of our initiative. So please access this information. Please feel free to contact us. I think I have a resource on everything that anybody has ever come up with. I save everything. So if you need examples, just let me know, Audrey or Mike, we can help you with this and we can help you have a successful experience. And if you have people teleworking now and it is informal, let us help you formalize your program so that you can ensure that it is successful and that it doesn't go away. So with that, other questions?
The only one that we haven't covered was a request for the presentation itself, and we'll make sure that we get it out to the participants. That's easy.
Let me tell you what the resources are that we provide. We can provide you with some slides for a senior management presentation. If you need to present this to your top management, you can get some of our slides. It talks about some of the factors that are important for senior managers to consider. We have the selection survey that I usually recommend that you have done as a self-assessment. Where there are unions or government agencies, sometimes they actually have the employee fill out the survey and submit it, just to make sure that things are clear from the get-go. We have sample surveys for you to evaluate your program. We have some of the information for your training sessions, and we just have a lot of stuff. So if there's anything, let us know. I see that there's other questions coming in. Let's see. If an employee working from home gets hurt during the working day, how does that impact the worker? It impacts the worker in the same way as if it were in the office. No difference. And it's no different than when you're traveling on a business trip. If you're on a business trip and you trip in the airport, your workers' comp covers you. So think of that when you're doing a telework program. Regarding compensation, compensation doesn't change unless there's a requirement. Oddly, the province of Ontario pays home workers $2 more. You're required to pay $2 more for people who work from home. That's the only place I know where they do that. How many employees, firms, does the panel think will continue working from home after COVID has passed? I would predict, and this is solely based on my LA experience, that you'll see 80% of the firms that will continue in some fashion. Where I have concerns is when there is an emergency and some people get used to teleworking and you say, okay, continue doing it, that you haven't addressed it in a formal fashion. You haven't created the policies. So if you're doing it right now informally, stop and formalize your program. That is the #1 factor between failure and success, coupled with training your teleworkers and your telemanagers. I hope that we can go from 12 to 14%. Denver has one of the higher rates of teleworking in the US, and our industry is such that there's no reason we can't get to 35%, like the Germans. So I call that our potential. But I do expect 80% to continue in some fashion.
That'd be nice. That's a good number, and that's a lot of commuter trips that wouldn't happen. So it'd be nice if it were 80. But it'd be great for some of the attendees in your own organization, if you have moved that way because of the pandemic, and you know that you have to just get through it. Do you think you're likely to continue? So if you all have experience directly and you have a sense of what your own organization might do, it'd be great to hear it. So feel free to unmute yourselves and just jump in.
And while we're waiting, we always look for case examples. So if you are doing this and you do a survey, please allow us to write you up as an example to share with other employers. We really lack good case examples here in Colorado. We went through the exercise of finding case examples probably 8 years ago, and we haven't updated them since. So we really look to you to help us with that. We got one person, April. Right.
Yeah, April, please jump in.
Can we unmute?
So Stuart, you have to click on her and then move her to a panelist, I believe.
Goodness.
You're the only one with that power.
What's that?
You're the
You
only
have
one
that
with that power.
Yikes. Okay. Okay. April allowed to talk. Great. Sorry, April. Well, we can't hear. Was it April?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. So our company is moving to this, taking the opportunity to reduce our office size actually for overhead costs by about 45%. So we're moving into this, and I'm a little freaked out because I don't know that there is a formalized plan. I think they're taking the opportunity to say, okay, COVID happened, let's stop paying as much as we're paying in lease. So I was curious to know if you had a formalized program or some sort of consulting program, if this is something that I could introduce to my, I guess I would move it to up HR to put something in place, because I do think we're just moving into this a little blind.
Yes, we can help you. First off, we have a survey that will evaluate your pilot experience with COVID. I would recommend that you do the survey first. We have it all written up and can provide you with a link so that you only have to distribute the link, and we'll tabulate the results and give that back to you. Once we see what employees are saying, we can see where there are issues, and that will help us develop the appropriate policies and procedures. If you do not have any policies regarding telework in your employee handbook, I have sample policies that we can provide to you that you can review with your attorney to make sure that they're correct for your organization. And then we can help you wherever you need the assistance. Use that 10-step list as a menu, and we can help you. What I typically do with employers now is I say, tell me which numbers you need. And people will say, I need help with 2, 5, and 7. And that's how we often can help and bring resources there. So I would encourage you to do the survey, access our resources. We are here to help you through this process. And the only thing we ask of you is to allow us to do a case study when you're done.
Okay. And will your contact information be included, I assume, in the presentation that's sent to participants?
Yes, it depends on which area you're in. Audrey's, Mike's, or mine. But one of us will get to you and provide the assistance you need.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Sure.
And Stuart, if you want to go to the next slide, it actually has the contact info for all 3 TMAs on there.
Great. Well, I know we're 1 minute over. It doesn't look like there's any other questions unless I'm not seeing that.
I think we got them.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. So on behalf of Audrey, Mike, myself, and Robbie, thank you for joining us. Let others know about this resource that we provide. We are happy to do future training sessions. So if there's others in your organization that will need this training, let us know. Or if you have another company, or if you're part of a SHRM group and are looking for assistance, let them know that we're here. We are publicly funded to help you with teleworking.